The oil-rich Middle Eastern nation of Qatar is going to build an airbase on US soil, or at least that was the headline that captivated the United States for several days straight after America's Secretary of Defense, or Secretary of War if you prefer, announced as much in a joint press conference at the Pentagon last Friday. Standing alongside the Minister of Defense of Qatar, Hegseth announced that America was proud to welcome a contingent of Qatari Air Force personnel at the Mountain Home Air Base in the state of Idaho. There, Qatari pilots would train on America's lethal F-15, flying freely over American airspace at will and living, working, and training out of a Qatari facility. The announcement drew outrage from all across America, not just from the country's liberal wing, but from some of the most die-hard supporters of Trump and his overall agenda. But sadly for the United States' breathless political pundits, the reality of the situation isn't half as controversial as the version of events that's being discussed. Are Qatari Air Force pilots getting their own facilities on US soil? Well, yes, actually. That's still an accurate statement. But the real state of affairs is far from the story that hardline conservatives and hardline liberals alike have been trying to tell. Conference and backlash. All right, close your eyes for a moment and imagine that you're America's Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, last Friday. You've got a couple of meetings, a couple of West Wing-style hallway briefings with your staff, and what's expected to be an open and shut affair with the Qatari Defense Minister speaking about the upcoming signing of the peace deal between Israel and Hamas. At the corresponding press conference, you'll also drop the news that the two nations are finalizing an on-site training agreement to welcome Qatari F-15 pilots and their support personnel to a rather nondescript Idaho airbase. There, American fighter squadrons host and fly F-15E Strike Eagles, and a National Guard complement flies the A-10 Warthog attack jet, while a group of pilots and personnel from the nation of Singapore train on their own jets in an arrangement similar to what the new arrivals from Qatar will ultimately do. You, Pete Hegseth, get to your meeting with the Qatari counterpart, Sheikh Saud bin Abdulrahman Al Thani, and you sit down together at a desk in chairs that are maybe just a little bit uncomfortable but not too terrible since you're not going to be there for very long. You and the Sheikh open your neat little binders to show the document in question, you pose for some photos, you give a few words on the Israel-Hamas ceasefire deal, and you slip in a bit of information about the new training deal, which you describe as, quote, just another example of our partnership. Then, within the span of just a few hours, the Republican Party's entire MAGA coalition blows up. That part wasn't exactly in the plan. Now look, we're going to discuss the deal that Washington and Doha actually signed, but first we've got to discuss what the majority of America's political pundits and commentators on both the right and the left seem to believe that Hegseth had laid out. According to a fair proportion of the immediate press coverage and a very high proportion of the online political discourse where most Americans would have come into contact with the story, this wasn't just a deal to train a few pilots. Instead, it was a deal that would essentially establish a Qatari military base on sovereign American soil. By some accounts, the United States would be gifting Qatar a portion of the Mountain Home Air Base, or perhaps the entire thing. By other accounts, the US was allowing Qatar to construct another facility from the ground up on the land that makes up part of the airbase, or could even be allowing Qatar to just build their own base from the ground up. Either way, the core message was clear. Qatar was building its own military base on American sovereign soil, and that state of affairs could simply not be allowed to stand. On the liberal side of the American political divide, criticism began to pile in almost immediately. The deal was an artifact of corruption. It showed just how deep in bed the Trump administration was with an oil-rich Gulf state that has a rather incredible record of human rights abuses. Not only that, but it's a Gulf state that recently gifted Trump a $400 million jet that may cost American taxpayers upwards of $1 billion to retrofit, and with which Trump's family company recently struck a massive deal to build a luxury golf resort. Even worse, the deal was with a nation that Trump himself had accused of being a, quote,
funder of terrorism at a very high level.
And for the American right, the coverage over the purported Qatari base was even more forceful, taken as a betrayal by the leader of their movement and a betrayal of the American values that Trump had claimed to defend. Speaking in Newsweek, critical Trump backer Steve Bannon ripped the decision to shreds, quote, there should never be a military base of a foreign power on the sacred soil of America. Then from prominent commentator Amy Malek, quote, I am in shock that Washington would approve a deal letting Qatar, Hamas's #1 financier, open a Qatari Air Force facility on US soil. From commentator Mike Madrid, Joe Biden was criticized for a Chinese balloon flying over our airspace. They're giving Qatar an entire effing airbase. Even more forceful was the criticism from one Laura Loomer, a close Trump confidant who's become something of a kingmaker within the MAGA wing of American politics. Loomer unleashed a tirade on social media from which we'll quote a few choice selections. "I have never felt more betrayed by the GOP than I do now watching Islamic jihadists get away with implementing Sharia law in the US, and now they are getting their own airbase where they will train to kill Americans." Another quote, "There isn't a single Trump supporter who supports allowing Qatar to have a military base on US soil." Then the act of ultimate inflammation in Trump's political coalition right now, "I don't think I'll be voting in 2026. And perhaps even worse from the Republican Party perspective, quote, "I think donors should stop wasting their money as well." For the modern Republican Party, where outrage is typically sent in every direction except towards America's president and his policies, the backlash to the Qatar deal was stunning. From America's liberal wing, it would have been expected, but not from the MAGA coalition, and certainly not so forcefully from such prominent voices within the movement. Granted, Hegseth's announcement could have been worded a bit better than it was. His exact words were, and we'll quote him here, "We're signing a letter of acceptance to build a Qatari Emiri Air Force facility at the Mountain Home Air Base in Idaho." Now, certainly we would understand how a person could get to the worst-case conclusions that American onlookers did, especially onlookers who aren't necessarily familiar with the ins and outs of bilateral military relationships. But look over the statement again, and you'll notice Hegseth did not at any point claim that the United States was simply gifting an American airbase to Qatar to use for its own purposes or allowing Qatar to build a new airbase on US soil from the ground up. The misunderstanding took on a life of its own, but it was just that. It was a massive, fundamental misunderstanding. Just before we go any further, just a quick pause to tell you about something we've been cooking up here at WarFronts, and we are excited to share it. And no, it's not the launch of WeebFronts. Jesus Christ, leave me alone. I've got enough channels. But I think it might be nearly as good as that. So have you ever got to the end of the week and found yourself thinking something along the lines of, oh man, I was just feeling so optimistic about the state of the world, and I'd love for that to be ruined by even more WarFronts. That would bring me down nicely. Well, good news for you, my friends. I hear you. In fact, we at WarFronts hear you so loudly, we're launching a brand new... It's that site. Subscriber service. Look at this. I set this up. That's where you can go. It's a place for people who see us putting out 6 videos a week and go, amateurs. For $5 a month, you'll get access to 2 exclusive videos each and every week. The first 2 are already up on whether Poland could win a war against Russia. Pretty timely, we know, you're welcome. And on just how South Korea came to make the best tank on Earth. And we've got a lot more in the pipeline, including a weekly show covering the 3 most important war stories everybody else is ignoring. And as a bonus, our writers are also producing 2 in-depth written articles a week for those of you who like to get their information the old-fashioned way. And now we know what you're thinking. Oh man, they're going to paywall videos. This sucks. Look, I have learned from the mistakes that every other YouTuber who launches something like this before me has made. No, we're still on YouTube. Everything is as it was before. There are still those 6 videos a week that we are grinding away making for you. You're so welcome. Everything on fronts.co is a bonus for those of you who want to cough up the princely sum of $5 American a month. So, if you want more of my face delivering important but oh so depressing news straight to your eyeballs, head over to fronts.co. God damn it, it's this side. It's so hard. My preview monitors. Here, fronts.co, not com. I couldn't get the com. The co was expensive enough. That's fronts.co, not com. And now back to today's video. Thank you. It also helps support the show. That wasn't in the copy, but it also helps us make videos, and thank you so much. Back to the episode. The truth of the case. All right, so what's actually going on here? At bare minimum, you could probably guess from our tone and presentation that the immediate public backlash to the deal might have missed the mark. But it's no exaggeration to say that compared to the thing that the American political sphere thought was happening in Qatar, well, the reality of the situation wouldn't even make headlines. This is a training deal, a fairly standard collaboration in which troops from other nations allied with the United States are sending their personnel to America to train on US military kit. The thing that Qatar is building on US soil is little more than a set of permanent accommodations safely stationed within the confines of an American military base where Qatari troops aren't even the only permanent foreign guests. Qatar's Air Force intends to fly 48 copies of the latest version of America's F-15, the F-15EX Eagle II, by the time that its current order for the jets is completely filled. To be clear, the F-15EX is a really good jet, and we have covered it at length on our sister channel Mega Projects if you'd like to learn more about it after you finish this video, of course. But the jet itself doesn't really matter, since it's not even what Qatari troops are going to be flying. During their time at Mountain Home Air Force Base, new Qatari pilots will rotate through and carry out advanced training on Qatar-owned F-15EX aircraft that they'll keep at the base, because of course they will. The planes will need to stay at the airbase, and they'll need to be housed in new hangars, which Qatar will build in order to avoid overstressing hangar capacity under the base's current conditions. And of course, those aircraft will be flown by pilots. Those pilots need literal accommodations. They need places to sleep, to eat, to hold classes, plan training missions, and fill the other routine functions of advanced air combat training. Qatar will also be sending maintenance personnel who will be charged with keeping Qatar's F-15s flying, and those personnel need the facilities to do their training. That's a lot of new personnel to accommodate on existing base infrastructure, and rather than try to find the room, the US gave Qatar clearance to build the corresponding facilities themselves. That is what's happening here. Qatar isn't building a new base or a parallel base or even a base within a base. They're building a compound to ensure that their pilots don't have to share a bunk with their American counterparts. The US will still oversee all base security, it'll still credential and check all personnel who need access, and the facilities will be built by local American workers doing work funded by Qatar. Now, even if Qatar were building a military base on American soil, that arrangement wouldn't be unusual in a global sense. It's a luxury that the United States doesn't have to host other militaries on its soil, but it's really common in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, including in many, many cases where it's the United States positioning its troops abroad. This situation, a long-term training arrangement, is even more standard, and it's something that the United States does routinely, including when training pilots from other nations. The US trains NATO pilots en masse at Shepherd Air Force Base in Texas. It trains Ukrainian pilots on F-16s in Arizona, and footage recently circulated on social media depicting Polish pilots performing complex maneuvers over US soil while finishing up their training in the stealthy F-35. From the Arab world, America trains fighter pilots for Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Iraq at various American military bases, and at the base in Idaho, Qatari pilots wouldn't even be the only foreign pilots finishing their advanced training. The base has hosted a similar arrangement with Singapore for years, and that relationship appears to be going swimmingly. And to say that anything about this arrangement would constitute a national security risk would demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. Qatar will have a handful of jets stationed at this base at most, where those jets will be housed alongside 3 complete F-15E Strike Eagle squadrons from the 366th Fighter Wing. Even if Qatari pilots decided to go rogue and try to use their F-15s for malevolent purposes, these pilots are trainees surrounded by several times as many American jets of similar model and operating ability flown by much more experienced operators. Even in the absolute worst-case scenario, between a hypothetical base sabotage, a breakaway by Qatar's pilots, and a failure to stop them from getting away from the base, Mountain Home Air Base is surrounded by other Air Force bases. Fairchild to the north, Ellsworth to the east, Hill to the south, and Beale to the west. Among the other aircraft stationed at those bases, there are no fewer than 4 squadrons of F-35s, which would be more than a match for anything Qatar is flying. Plus, the air defense systems in the area protecting not just American air bases, but stored nuclear weapons in several surrounding states. To say that this part of America is locked down would be a little bit of an understatement, wouldn't it? And finally, the geopolitics of the situation simply don't suggest that Qatar would have any interest in posing a threat to the US, or at least not by telling a couple of F-15EX trainees to go rogue in the middle of nowhere above Idaho. Look, as we said, Qatar is a major non-NATO ally. It benefits tremendously from its financial relationship with both the United States and the Trump family. Qatar has been a key mediator in the Middle East for years, including helping to broker the most recent ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. And when Israel flagrantly violated Qatar's sovereignty in an airstrike to try and kill Hamas leaders recently, Qatar chose to parlay the international pressure to further America's goals in reaching a ceasefire, which it did successfully. Qatar does host groups like Hamas and the Taliban on its soil, but it does that at America's request to keep lines of communication open with groups that could otherwise become impossible to negotiate with. And while Qatar is building a small set of facilities on an American airbase, it hosts the largest American military base in the entire Middle East. Take a deep breath, take a step back, and the deal to construct facilities for Qatari pilot trainees at an American airbase is about as close to a non-issue as we could possibly get. Unfortunately, the news was easy to take out of context, even easier to misinterpret, and it turned into far more of a flashpoint than it realistically should have been. With any luck, for our American audience in particular, the situation might now finally make a bit more sense. Thank you for watching.